There is a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from working too little. It comes from working exactly as hard as you were told to, following every rule that was handed to you, and still arriving at the end of the month with a quiet, unsettling feeling that the numbers simply don't add up the way they once did. You did everything right. You got the degree, took the job, paid the bills, maybe even bought the house, and yet something feels structurally off, like a floor that looks solid but gives slightly under your weight every time you step on it. That feeling isn't a personal failure, and it isn't an illusion. It is the output of a very specific set of mathematical and systemic shifts that have been running quietly in the background for roughly 5 decades, and once you understand the mechanics behind them, the feeling starts to make complete sense. To understand what's happening, you have to start with a concept called real wages, which is simply what your paycheck can actually buy after inflation is accounted for. Nominal wages, the number printed on your contract, have gone up over the decades. But real wages, adjusted for the true cost of living, have remained largely flat for the median American worker since the early 1970s. What this means in practical terms is that someone earning $40,000 today is not meaningfully wealthier in purchasing power than someone earning $18,000 in 1975. Once you run the numbers through inflation, the raise you received last year may have been 3%, but if inflation ran at 4 or 5%, you effectively took a pay cut without anyone telling you. The paycheck grew, and the life it could purchase quietly shrank. But stagnant wages are only one layer of this equation, and arguably not even the most important one. The deeper mechanism is what economists call cost divergence, the phenomenon where the prices of certain essential categories of spending have grown at rates dramatically faster than both inflation and wage growth simultaneously. Housing, healthcare, education, and childcare have not simply kept pace with general inflation over the past 50 years. They have outrun it by extraordinary margins. College tuition in the United States, adjusted for inflation, is roughly 19 times more expensive than it was in 1980. Healthcare costs have grown at nearly twice the rate of general inflation for decades. Median home prices relative to median household income have moved from a ratio of roughly 3-to-1 in the 1970s to over 5-to-1, and in major metropolitan areas, that number climbs well past 8 or 10-to-1. These are not lifestyle upgrades. These are the baseline costs of a stable, functional, middle-class life, and they have structurally repriced themselves out of proportion with what middle-class incomes can comfortably absorb. This is where the psychology becomes particularly important to understand, because the human brain does not naturally process gradual systemic drift. It processes comparison. And what the middle class is quietly comparing itself to, whether consciously or not, is the version of middle-class life that existed for their parents or grandparents, where a single income could purchase a home, raise children, fund education, and provide retirement security without financial engineering. That version of the middle class was not the product of superior personal discipline or smarter individual choices. It was the product of a specific economic moment: post-war growth, compressed wage structures, cheap housing, and the absence of student debt as a precondition for entering the labor market. Conditions that no longer exist and have not existed for a long time. The psychological distress comes not from poverty, but from the gap between expectation and mathematical reality, and that gap has been widening steadily. There is also a second mathematical force operating here that rarely gets named clearly, and it is the cost of financial complexity itself. The middle class today must navigate a level of financial decision-making that previous generations simply were not required to manage. Defined benefit pensions that paid automatically have been largely replaced by defined contribution accounts that require active investment literacy. Healthcare has shifted from employer-covered plans to high-deductible structures that require individuals to build separate savings vehicles to cover routine medical costs. The administrative burden of being middle class, managing deductibles, optimizing retirement allocations, refinancing debt, evaluating insurance structures has grown substantially. And mismanaging any one of those systems carries real financial consequences that previous generations were largely insulated from. It is not simply that life is more expensive. It is that the cost of getting the financial decisions wrong has increased at the same time that the decisions themselves have become more complex. What all of this adds up to is a system where the lived experience of the middle class has diverged from its statistical definition, where the feeling of falling behind is not a psychological distortion, but an accurate reading of the underlying mathematics. Understanding this does not immediately change the numbers, but it does change something important. It removes the false premise that the answer is simply working harder or spending less carefully, and it points instead toward the structural levers that actually govern financial outcomes at scale, which are the things worth studying if you want to understand not just why the middle class feels poorer, but what the architecture of that pressure actually looks like and where, historically, such systems have shifted before.